Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the special 300th episode and a little bit of debrief background information of what's all gone on. And just, this is a moment I like hitting these big milestones and looking back kind of on what the last 50 plus episodes, plus it's usually about a year, 52 weeks in a year. There's a lot of reflection that happens in these times and a lot of things that goes on. And it's also a moment where I can give you a little bit more background on what's going on this side of the microphone that doesn't always come across in the week to week. And for me, this is kind of an exciting period of time. It's amazing to me to be thinking about that I've suddenly hit 300. It's one of those things that when you initially set out to do this, it's not like you really think about it. You don't really contemplate how much work, time, and effort necessarily something's going to take. But when you have desire, when you have passion, you make it happen. And so thus you keep finding yourself behind a microphone. As I am approaching 6 years of doing this weekly, that's a crazy number to be thinking about. And I remember even just early on stating how I wanted to have a catalog similar to like what Working Preacher has. And when they were starting, granted, they're still much further along than I was when I first started doing this and referencing that. Now, being that as we get toward the podcast's 6th birthday, which will be the 31st of the year, 30th or 31st, it's always right in there in December. But that means we'll be going through the lectionary for a third time. And so for me, that's kind of exciting. It's a little nerve-wracking. But it's fun. It's still a lot of fun to get behind the mic and start talking to you guys and figuring out how faith and science is going to come together every single week. And I credit a lot of it to the people who are on the other end of this, who are listening to it week after week, sending comments. I know sometimes that isn't always happening, but I definitely hear it in conversations, and it really is helpful. When you're doing something this long, this consistently, it can be very draining, and it's really exciting and awesome to hear from people how much impact this does make and how having these conversations is something that as a world and as a society, we need to be having more of, and especially as a church, we need to be having more of. So there's a couple different things that I want to talk about. There's a couple things I've referenced this year, good things that have happened, things that have happened in a different way than we've expected over the last year, and kind of talking about what am I forecasting. If I had to forecast for the next year, what's that looking like? So I think for me, one of the major highlights this year was being part of Gus Davis Academy for Faith, Science, and Ethics. That was super awesome to be invited to be part of that, to be around some amazing high school and college age students with that. It was one of the highlights of the year for me with this podcast. And I distinctly remember being in the hotel room that I was on campus there and just reflecting on, I had just given a talk to the kids for an hour and just was in an absolute amaze and astonishment on how far that I had come. That suddenly here I was being looked at as someone who knew something to be able to talk to young people about this stuff. And it all started in my childhood bedroom, basically. And we've talked a little bit about that before in past of these episodes, how it's been really helpful, probably for my mental health, to be able to get through some difficult times in my life. But it was just really the epitome of, I had dreamed all this different stuff, and this was kind of the first time it was really coming to fulfillment in a real tangible way. And that was super exciting to me, and it still is super exciting looking back and thinking about it. And I just have to thank Gustavus Adolphus so much for that and for that opportunity. And for me, it was this moment of kind of, all right, you're doing something awesome and being able to get to that point. One of the things that's been a challenge this year is there has been some different grant opportunities that didn't quite come through the way that I was hoping to. And I think I'll state it this way, and I think I've maybe announced it a little bit, but I'm purposely leaving details pretty broad. But I plan on launching a second podcast with Still the Weekly podcast that's more of an interview-based podcast, looking at more of interviewing people within the scientific field and how faith and science works together in their lives. I have a tentative title in my head, but I'll keep that in my brain at this moment. And I'm really excited about it. In fact, today I potentially got an email that is looking optimistic about some things with that. The biggest thing for me with it is I know it's going to be a huge time suck and a lot of time and resources going into that, and I want to make sure that I do it right. So there's some hardware upgrades that I'm hoping to make, some software upgrades on my end that I'm hoping to make all at the same time, and along with making sure it's the right time and where God is wanting it to be. And there's a couple things where I'm noticing where there's some obstacles in the way that aren't typical obstacles. And for me, I'm just starting to realize, then be patient. Don't be pushing the issue. So that is something I'm really looking forward to. I have been dreaming about for quite literally years. It's been something that I've been really wanting to do, but it's also finding that right time to be able to jump into that and not rushing it. And on this one, I really feel like God is saying, just wait a little longer. So I'm excited about it. I'll say that much. Expect that it's coming at some point. I'll give you more details as it gets closer and closer, but it's not there yet. We'll put it that way. I am really excited about what it can bring. I'll probably post it still on the same station, the same REL. It'll be the same part of the podcast. I'll just have a different title, so it shouldn't be hard to find when that time comes. But again, that's probably still a few months away. I'm hoping that by the end of 2024 for sure, that we've at least had a couple episodes in and kind of trying those out and seeing how people are reacting to them, thinking about them. If you have ideas or if you have different things to think about with that, that'd be awesome. I think one of the other things that I would also state for a goal for 2024 is twofold. One, I am slowly expanding which social media networks we are on. I have targeted a couple more that I would like to get to that I think can help with long-term growth. But it's one of those things that in doing that, I want to make sure that I'm doing it and doing it well. So if you look right now, we are on Facebook, both a group and more like a business page. We're on LinkedIn. We are on Twitter, which is now X. So there's a couple more major ones in particular that I'm looking at that I would love to expand into. But again, I'm wanting to do it well and being able to maintain this and do it in a manner that I think is going to be engaging for all of you is so important. I also just want to say this year has been a crazy year just looking at the metrics that I can see from my back end. And I'll put it this way. By June 30 this year, I had more listens than I had ever had the whole of 2021 together. So in 6 months, the podcast already had more listeners than all of 2021, which didn't even then include July was the best listened to month ever that I've had with the podcast, which then followed by some humbling months here the last couple months. It's been a little more humbling, we'll put it that way, where some numbers have slowed down. They're still better than where they were in 2021, but it's been a roller coaster that way. But it's also, from my back end, I get excited with being able to look at where all these podcasts get to. You know, on a month-to-month basis, we're more getting to typical English-speaking countries. But let me count this up real quick. So overall, since the launching of the podcast online, we have reached 35 countries, which to me is pretty crazy. If you want to go through your more developed countries, we've reached most of the United States. There's a couple states we have left. So if you want to make my day, Hawaii, Guam, Vermont, Maine, and Delaware and Rhode Island are the only states left that I haven't had a listen to. If you want to go to Canadian provinces, we are talking the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Newfoundland, and then we get to Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So kind of more the fringes there. Australia, we're missing Victoria, we're missing Tasmania, we're missing the Northern Territory and the Western Australia territories. In the UK, I'm still looking for Northern Ireland and Wales. But it's really fun for me where some of these where I am getting more of the territories and stuff that I'm able to see what parts of the country and different things of that nature. And for me, that is just another encouragement where I know that the majority of where this podcast is going to be listened to is in the United States. I realize that the majority of the people who are going to be listening to this podcast are probably in the Lutheran denomination. Maybe we'll get some Catholics in there. I realize that the scope of what we're looking at here is fairly narrow. So for me, it's just really impressive to be able to see where we're getting all over the globe with it, and it's really fun to see that. One of the other goals that I'm hoping that maybe I at least have the foundations for by the end of 2024 would be I want to revamp the website. Right now, I've been using the free stuff that I get from my provider, where I upload the podcast to be able to distribute to all the different podcasting hosts. My host, technically. I would love to revitalize that, and I have some ideas on how I would like it to look to be able to make it easier for people who aren't necessarily following the Revised Common Lectionary, being able to find links to times when I've talked about certain texts and different things of that nature. I know it'll be a huge overhaul again. So it's one of these things where there's a lot of these projects that I realize are going to be a lot of work. On top of, I still have my wife, I still have a household and family and friends that I'm still trying to keep in touch with as well. So a lot of big dreams, which sometimes then take a little while to develop. Finally, I just want to thank a lot of people. I want to thank especially my wife. She knows the crazy hours that I put into this. She also knows how, in a lot of ways, you don't think about it, but how much your life gets kind of tweaked and redone when you're doing a podcast like this. It's a little bit different than I would assume a pastor giving a sermon every week, because one of the things is I have to think it, I have to then say it, I have to listen back to it and edit it, and then I have to distribute it. So it's a little bit different processing on that end that makes it different. And so there's times, especially by the time that I'm delivering it out, I've probably thought it or heard it mentally in my head 4 or 5 times. So sometimes there's just even the mental gap of just being able to do that. But I'm really thankful to have an amazing, supportive wife who really has helped me with that. There's been a lot of friends and family who have also been extremely supportive. There are some diligent, loyal listeners who almost on a weekly basis are sending me messages or talking to me. And you guys do not know how much that means, how often it's sometimes very difficult to get in front of the microphone again and to know that there are people who are consistently listening, it makes all the difference in the world. It really does. And getting those messages, getting those comments, writing on social media, that makes a huge difference. It really is good for the mental side of things, but also the encouragement that your thoughts are being heard, considered, and thought about to be able to have some type of discussion. And that's really the heart of it, because you get the academic, scientific side of you research to bring new ideas to the table, to discuss them, to think about things, to contemplate things. And there's a lot of similarities with that with faith as well. And so when you're having those types of interactions, there is nothing better, in my opinion. And I really enjoy that. I really enjoy that is part of the conversation, and making that more and more part of the conversation, of bringing those groups that a lot of people see so separate, but yet we've continued to show time and time again how closely related they actually are. And that, to me, is exciting. And to me, I really hope encourages people to continue down that path, to take that challenging step to talk about some of the stuff, even though it sometimes is difficult, or being willing and able to take that step outside of necessarily a faith circle, or taking that step outside of just that scientific community to bring faith into that equation, I think is really important. And I find it funny how often when we're separating them, there are certain topics that are so difficult to talk about, but how many times you've heard me talk about, I'm hearing people having a difficult time with this, but I have something this week that I think is going to bring them together, and it's coming at it from a different field's perspective helps explain the other. And I think they really do, faith and science, work hand in hand so well together that we have to allow the space for that to happen. So, it's been an amazing 300 episodes. I know one of the things that I'm going to try, and I would love if a listener maybe even help me with this, we're going to keep plugging away here. So we have, next year, it'll be probably in late September, we're going to hit episode 350. And so then right around the end of the year, end of 2024, we should be hitting about episode 365. I would love to know personally, when is the day that people could go through and listen to just the Faith and Science podcast episodes, not these special ones or the intro ones, but if they could listen to a podcast a day, and that the last day there is the launch of episode 355, and then also we could calculate it out just one more week or so for 366. Because to me, I just think that'd be really fun mentally for me to be able to see when could a person start listening and hear one every single day, that they're hearing how faith and science can come together. And for me, the passage of time that has happened in that is just incredible. It's hard to imagine. One final thing before I kind of wrap this up, and it's something that I meant to bring up at 250, and it was almost immediately after I shut off the microphone that why didn't I say that? I think a fun fact about the podcast in and of itself is, so every week you hear the intro music and you hear the outro music, but especially the intro music, that's all put in post. I don't have a cue or anything like that. That's all put in post. And for me, one of the things, especially at the end of the podcast, it's kind of interesting to kind of hear where that music starts playing for the end of the episode. Because there's sometimes I having recorded it and then putting in that music, and I'm like, ooh, I still have a point or two that I'm going to get across here in this last little bit as it's getting into that outro music. I will say, if there is a musician that would like to, try making some different intro, outro music, I'd love to maybe potentially look at changing that up a little bit. Being 6 years almost, sometimes a little change isn't necessarily a bad thing. And I think that's one of the biggest questions that I still have for you guys is, if there are ways to make this podcast better, to make this easier, to make it, I wish you had this, or I wish there was this discussed more, or I wish you touched this topic more, or I wish we had longer to work on how, different parts of the podcast, or it'd be cool if you had this part to the podcast, let me know. I still wholeheartedly believe I want this to be a place that we're learning together, but also that it's beneficial for you on the other end of the microphone as much as it is me. The coolest thing I will say with this is there is so much that I've learned, so much that I've grown, so much that is hard always to get across in the microphone. That has happened because of this. There's so many opportunities that I feel like have opened up because of this, and this isn't even that big, which is crazy for me to think about. But I think it's also the realization and reality that that's how God works. God doesn't necessarily take the most qualified person. I am definitely not the most qualified. He doesn't take necessarily the most educated. I am definitely not the most educated. But he does take those with a willing heart. And he does take those that he inspires to be able to move forward and take what you have and run with it. And realize that God's right there with you. And that to me is the secret sauce. Is the weeks that I'd much rather go to bed, the weeks that I'm just sitting there and what the heck are we going to figure out to do? It's amazing, but somehow it comes around. And I feel like that's kind of how God works a lot for our lives. And I think it means us acknowledging that is a good thing. A good thing for us to recognize and realize the holy. So as we are walking in here to episodes post 300, I will say I'm still very excited about where we're going. I'm still very excited about what's to come. There are still ideas that I would like to do. I have talked about some of these ideas to people, and there's a lot of excitement. But I'm also realizing that as much as I'm excited, God's timing's better than my own timing. And sometimes that means waiting a little while longer. And when you've been doing this for almost 6 years, waiting a little while longer is okay. I'm not going anywhere. I'm still going to keep on plugging away because there's still more faith and science to talk about. And like one of my mentors said at the beginning of this whole thing, before I'd recorded one podcast, when I was questioning, do I really want to get into this arena? And his comment was to me, Tyler, why are you afraid about that? You can outlive them, and you got more time to figure it out. And I think we're starting to figure some things out, but there's still a lot more to figure out and a lot more places to dig into. Heck, we just started talking about deep space. There's a lot more we can get into with that. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.